So many different variables you can look at. What are the ones that you'd use, and how did they essentially use them? So the first thing that Lynch did is he looked at the EPS growth of the firm to put it into several different categories. If it was growing under 10% a year, he called it a slow grower. If it was growing between 10 and 20%, he called that a stalwart. And if it was growing faster than 20%, he called that a fast grower. And he had different criteria for selecting each of the stocks, depending whether it was a stalwart, slow grower, or a fast grower. For the purposes right now to simplify, we're just going to talk about the fast growers. So if it was a fast grower, one of the things that he was famous for was the PEG ratio, the price to earnings growth ratio, where you're essentially comparing the price to earnings ratio of a company to its growth rate. So that way that you don't overpay. His optimum case was if the price to earnings ratio was half the growth rate. So if you're growing at 30%, let's say, the ideal case is the price to earnings ratio would be 15 or under. And if they were about the same, then it wouldn't matter to him. He wouldn't be interested if it was over a 1-to-1 ratio. He focused on the inventory to sales. He wanted to make sure that the inventory was not growing faster than the sales, which would be a sign that the growth was about to peak. Total debt to equity was something that he looked at. If the debt to equity ratio of the company was less than 30%, that was the best case. If it was greater than 80% and the firm was not a utility firm can have a much higher debt ratio, that would essentially cause this to fail. One of the interesting things in my study of all of these masters is that very few ratios were in common to the masters, but debt to equity was something that almost all of the gurus, masters, essentially had. The price to earnings ratio was also very interesting. It's the most common ratio that everybody knows. It's what brokers quote. It's what magazine articles quote. And less than half the gurus essentially used the price to earnings ratio. When they did, they all had their own special twist to it. So Peter Lynch, for fast growers, he would not even apply a PE ratio to it unless the sales were over $1 billion. If it was under $1 billion, it would not apply. If it was over $1 billion, he wanted to see the price to earnings ratio at less than 40 for the growth companies. Another interesting thing about Lynch was that it was possible to actually grow fast for a company. If the earnings per share growth was over 50%, his feeling was that was unsustainable and he would throw it out. His ideal sweet spot for a fast-growing company was between 20 and 25%. And finally, he had some bonus criteria, such as if there was free cash flow per share, a very high amount, or a very amount of actual net cash per share that was on the books. Those would be, he would not insist on it, but boy, he sort of said, mortgage up your house and pay for it if you do find companies that also met those other criteria as well as this. So I'm actually going to show you from the Masters of Wall Street site current stock selections and how you would actually use it if you wanted to develop a portfolio from it. And this will take just a second to get there. This is the new Masters of Wall Street site from Investing Daily. And here would be a list. Some current selections from the Peter Lynch strategy. I'll just show you from the bottom. Celestica, which basically is a supply chain company. Green Dot Corporation, and Humana would be three choices, ticker symbol HUM. It's possible to find out how many of the masters essentially like that and other statistical information about this. What's also interesting about this system is you can just take the selections as they are and invest in a portfolio, But if you want to find out why the particular master actually selected it, why it actually passed the criteria, you can essentially do that. By clicking on any of these, you can get a step-by-step analysis of what was important to making that decision. And in fact, if you have a question about any stock, you can put in its ticker symbol and get a step-by-step analysis by any of the gurus that you choose. So going to the strategy of Warren Buffett. Now, Warren Buffett's interesting because he himself has not actually authored a particular book about how he goes about picking it up. He's dropped clues here and there, but the best organized work out of all the books I've seen on Warren Buffett was written by his ex-daughter-in-law, Mary Buffett, and that's the one that I actually use for basing the strategy on. So first key thing is to determine if the company is actually even a Buffett-type company. Does it have the lowest cost basis in an industry? Does it have the ability to pass on costs? Is the business model complex or simple? Is it a leader in its industry? Assuming that it does meet that criteria, we're going to actually then look through some quantitative things. One of the most important things, and in essence to his success, is he looked for earnings predictability. He wanted to see that the earnings were going up almost each and every year, and not just for a few-year period of time, but over 10 years. And the reason that this was so important was that, while normally you can't make projections 10 years out on a company with any kind of reliability at all, his type of companies, you actually can. And it only works if there's fairly steady trends in the earnings per share of the company. He would accept some dips, by the way, in the earnings, but more than 45% over a 10-year period of time. Second thing, long-term debt. Here, Warren has another interesting twist, and that is he compares the debt not to equity, but to the actual earnings capability of a company. So he would like to see, ideally, the very best case is that the company can repay its long-term debt using 2 years' worth of earnings, but in worst case, no worse than 5 years' worth of earnings. Return on equity, not just over the last couple of years, but again over 10 years, he wanted to see that it averaged 15% or better for the investor. Return on capital, not just with the equity, but he also wanted to check, because some companies can be heavily financed with debt, that the return also was at least greater than 12%, even with the debt added. Capital expenditures, his ideal company had a positive free cash flow, so money was not being put back in the business, but could actually be spun off from the business. Utilization of retained earnings, basically wanted to see that when the management of the company over the years kept money in retained earnings rather than paying it back in dividends, that they could actually get a better than 15% return on it. And if it couldn't, that would be a failure for the company. Even once the company passed all of those particular criteria, and that's quite a lot, he then asked the question, well, is the price right now at a low enough price that if I bought in, that I could make a return from it? He looked 2 different ways of actually calculating the return from the company. He projected out the price per share of the company out 10 years using different methods, and again, that's why the predictability was so important. And if the average of this was greater than 15% or at least 12%, that's when he would become interested in buying the company, saying that's the type of return that I'm looking for. So I'm going to switch to a couple of Buffett picks right now. And one of the things that you're going to notice is very interesting. The top 4 choices on the Buffett portfolio right now actually turn out to be Dollar Tree, Ross Stores, Coach, TJX companies, which is very interesting. They're all retailers, all in clothing. One of the things that's surprising, because often clothing retailers have a very terrible reputation, nevertheless, these companies have steady, predictable cash flow. Their earnings have been increasing every year, including the downturn of 2008. They've been marvelous cash producers, and because they're unpopular, they create good times to essentially buy. So Dollar Tree, Ross Stores, Coach, and TGX. And then Benjamin Graham. So Benjamin Graham is generally considered the father of value investing. He's had several bright prodigies. His most well-known prodigy, of course,